This is the 182 sequencer module from Behringer System 100. Sequencers belong to my most favorite modules because they allow an unskilled keyboard player, like I am, to create beautiful melodies. Before we look at this specific one here, let's shed some light on the different types of sequencers. And if you're not interested, just skip to the actual review a bit later in this video. The general working principle of step sequencers is quite simple. They feature several steps, and each step holds a different tunable control voltage or a gate information, and only one step is active at a time. And this active step outputs its values to a CV or gate output. Then the next step becomes active and outputs its values, then the next step, and so on. By connecting an oscillator to the CV output, we can create melodies by tuning the single steps of the sequencer, but we don't have to care about keeping the tempo or remember the right keys to press, as if we would play this melody on a keyboard. This gives us free hands to tune the other components in our patch, like filters or other voices. The repeated switching through the steps is called the transport, and most sequencers have an internal clock to govern the transport speed, but most of them are also syncable to an external clock. Some sequencers feature different transport modes. The most typical ones are forward, backward, pendulum, and random. These are pretty standard, but there are also more complex transport modes out there. Like this here, which is called the stagger mode, and it sometimes reverses one step before it proceeds into the forward direction. The sequencer here is the Pittsburgh modular microsequencer, which I really love because it's super space efficient and full of features. And it also looks very nice. So we probably should do a little categorization for the different sequencer types to not lose track here. First, we have trigger sequencers that we don't use to tune melodies, but to create rhythms, for example, to trigger drum modules. This one here from Robo is a good example. It features 16 independent trigger tracks with lots of additional features, but it has no CV output, so we can only use it to trigger other modules, but not to control the pitch of an oscillator, for example. Then we have pure CV sequencers that only output CVs but no gates or triggers. The voltage block from Malaco is a good example here. It only outputs CVs, but it has no gate or trigger output. The most tiny sequencer probably in the whole Eurorack world is the 2HP SEQ, which is a full-featured CV sequencer with 16 steps, several scales for quantization, and a step-by-step programming. It has no internal clock and also no gate output, so it's a pure CV sequencer. And then we have the combination of those two, so CV and gate sequencers, which are probably the most common types. We already had the Pittsburgh microsequencer earlier in this video, which falls into this category as it features a CV and a gate output. But also the Korg SQ1, for example, which is a super handy addition also for the Eurorack. The Döpfer Dark Time, the Division 6 dual sequencer, only to name a few, fall into the category of CV plus gate sequencers. We could also try a different categorization, one that distinguishes the different operating principles. The classic step sequencer features rotary knobs to set the CV for each step, and some feature also switches for the gate state, so you can switch the gates on or off for the single steps, and you can also skip some steps. In the Eurorack world, sequencers often use faders because they are a bit more space efficient, but the principle stays the same, as we have a dedicated fader here for each step. The second category involves sequencers that have to be programmed step by step, like the Division 6 one. Here you switch through the steps and assign a node to them, and you do this step by step. And this means you cannot adjust your sequence while it is already running. Most keyboard-based sequencers fall into the same category, like the Arturia key step here, where you also enter your sequence node by node. I personally prefer sequencers with dedicated knobs or faders for each step, because they allow an on-the-fly tuning and often result in a bit more creative results than these keyboard-based sequencers where you tend to enter your already known melodies. Somewhere in between these two categories is the voltage block, because you can alter your sequence on the fly, but it rather has one fader per track than one fader per step, so it's something in between. But it gives very creative and interesting results. A very rudimentary way of sequencing is to use a clock sequencer and a mixer. The clock sequencer advances with every clock pulse and outputs 10 volt from its active step. And we use the mixer to attenuate this voltage and then feed it into our destination. This way of sequencing is very pure and analog, and it doesn't feature any quantization unless you use an extra quantizer module. It makes you tune your melodies by ear and not by some predefined scale, which sometimes leads to some very pleasing, unconventional results. And here I used the Döpfer clock sequencer and the linear mixers from Döpfer to create this simple way of CV sequencing. Quantization is a feature which is part of most modern sequencers, but wasn't available in the early ones that were included in the ARP 2500 or in the Moog modular or in the System 100. This sequencer here features 2 CV channels with 8 steps each and has tuning knobs for each step, and each channel has its own CV output. We can also make this a 16-step sequencer with this switch here set to series, but let's leave it in parallel mode for now. Here we have a gate output which is equal for both channels, and both channels always have the same length and no skipping options or additional gate on/off options. So this sequencer outputs a gate with every step, and always the same step is active in both channels. That's why there is only one LED for both. You can actually achieve 2 sequences with different lengths, but this mode is a bit weird, and I will cover it in a few moments. Here we have the tempo setting for the internal clock, a portamento for the CV1 output, and a gate length control. The internal clock spans from about 25 milliseconds per step up to about 8 seconds if we use the tempo knob only. However, with this CV input here, it even goes up into the audio rate. The CV input goes on top of the manual tempo setting, and we can achieve some nice effects with that. I will cover this in a few moments. The gate length is adjustable roughly between 10% and 90%, and the portamento here, or delay as it is named here, affects only output 1 and is a bit hard to tune, in particular for shorter delays. Here we can set the length of the sequence between 1 and 8 steps, and if you put the sequencer into series mode, this switch sets the length plus 8, so it will run through the first 8 steps and then through the additional steps that you have set here with this selector. Right now it's set to 6, which means it runs through 8 steps plus another 6 one, which is a total of 14 steps. The behavior of the two CV outputs is interesting in series mode, as the CV1 output switches to the right channel after the first 8 steps are completed. And then it takes the voltages that we have set here in the right channel as output until the sequencer reaches the end of the sequence that we have set with this selector here. However, the right CV output stays in the right channel, so it runs through the right CVs for the first 8 steps, and then again through the right CVs for the additional steps that we have set here. So the CV2 output always stays in the right channel, and the CV1 output switches from left to right after the first 8 steps have been completed, and then it takes the voltages from the right side for the additional step count, which we have set here with the step length selector. So lots of different options to create fancy sequences. If we put the sequencer back into parallel mode, it's a bit simpler, because then the CV1 output always takes the voltages that we set here in the left channel, and the CV2 output takes the voltages that we set here in the right channel. And with the step length, we can just set the length of both sequences, and they will always be synchronized, so they switch back to step 1 at the same time. So you cannot achieve different lengths of these sequences. Here we can set the transport mode of the sequencer. The transport direction is always forward, and in repeat mode, the sequencer repeats its sequence after reaching the last step, and it is governed by its internal clock only. We can start and stop the sequence using this button or the trig in input. The first trigger starts the sequence and the second one stops it and resets the sequencer back to step 1. And this is the normal operating mode, so to say. The step mode is handy for tuning, and we can advance one step with each press of this start-stop button, or if we use the trigger input. And in this way we can also sync it to an external clock signal. In the single mode, the sequencer only runs through its sequence once and then stops, and we can reset it with the button or with a trigger input, and then restart it with the next trigger or the next press of this button. This trig out output is only relevant in step mode, and it provides a short trigger output when the sequence reached its end and returns to the first step. This is handy for synchronization, or we could even make this sequencer a clock divider in this way, but that's a bit of a funny use for it, I guess. In step mode, we can also try and trigger it with an audio rate signal, for example from a VCO. That would give us a morphable waveform oscillator or a sub-oscillator. However, the highest rate seems to be somewhere around 64 Hz, which is a bit below a C2 on the note scale. And for higher trigger input frequencies, the sequencer just stops and does not follow the trigger pulses anymore. I mentioned earlier that we have this tempo CV input here, and we can also use this to bring the sequencer into the audio rate. By using this feature, we actually can use it as a morphable waveform oscillator by tuning the steps and creating very different waveforms by doing so. However, it does not track 1 volt per octave, which makes it a bit unhandy, but still one can achieve some nice results with this feature. Another nice thing about the tempo CV is that we can feed the sequencer output into here and create uneven step length by doing so, and this results in some very interesting sequences. So let me conclude. The 182 module is a dual sequencer with very limited transport options and no additional options to adjust the gate states for certain steps or something else. Probably the most important thing here is that there is no quantization at all. The output always spans between 0 and 5 volt, so the maximal range most oscillators can use for their pitch CV inputs. The original sequencer module from Roland, by the way, had a range switch for the outputs like their modern counterparts from Korg or Döpfer also have. So here you can adjust your output CV range between 0 and 1 volt, for example, or 0 and 2 or 0 and 5 volt, which makes it much more easier to tune your steps. So with this 182 sequencer from Behringer here, you will want to attenuate your pitch CV before it enters the oscillator to have a more comfortable tuning of the single steps. The System 100 modules all have their own attenuators here in the CV input mixers, which is very handy in this case here. My personal opinion about this sequencer is twofold. On the pro side, it comes close to the original, and it is a must-have for the complete System 100, and that's basically the reason why I bought it. Another pro argument is the missing quantization, which makes you tune your melodies by ear and not within any fixed scale, which boosts creativity and creates outside-the-box tunes. On the other side, however, if I had no other System 100 modules and of course I wanted to have the full set here, I probably wouldn't go for this sequencer, because there are so many other great sequencers out there with more comprehensive interaction, more gate options, more transport options, and so on. But as I said, if you're into the System 100, the 182 is probably the one that you want to choose to complete your system, and it really lets you create amazing melodies.